I was mid-sip of my champagne, the ocean glittering under the moonlight, when my niece leaned in and whispered, "Auntie, stop the boat now." Her voice trembled, her eyes scanning the room as if danger was closing in. Most people don't know that 68% of financial abuse cases happen within families, and I was about to be one of them. In less than 24 hours, every dollar I owned could be signed away, and the ones plotting it were smiling at me from across the table. I didn't realize the deadliest storm wasn't outside the ship. It was seated at my dinner table. It was 2:07 a.m. when my phone lit up on the nightstand. I almost ignored it, thinking it was some scam call, but the name on the screen made my chest tighten. Margaret. My older sister never called me this late. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the answer button, but then I picked up. "Liz." Her voice cracked like she'd been crying. "I know it's late, but I need to talk to you. We all miss you. We've been talking and we think it's time to make things right." I sat up in bed, the cool air from the open window brushing my shoulders. "What do you mean?" She inhaled sharply, like the words cost her something. "A family cruise, just us, no drama, 7 days together. We haven't been the same since, it's been too long." The hung between us like a ghost. I did know. Years of tense dinners, broken promises, and the kind of unspoken resentments that fester when you've given too much. I had distanced myself for survival, but hearing her voice in the dead of night stirred something deep, guilt, the kind you can't rationalize away. "I'll think about it," I murmured, though in my gut I already felt the pull. "Please, Liz, it could change everything for us," she said. Then she whispered something almost too soft to catch. "This trip will change everything, but not in the way you think." The line went dead before I could ask her what that meant. 2 weeks later, I was on the phone with the cruise booking line, giving them my card details. Margaret had insisted on handling the reservations to make it easier, so all I had to do was cover my share. She'd sounded so grateful when I offered. "You're the best, Liz. Really, this means a lot to all of us." But then my bank app pinged. Not just the cabin fee, but a series of other charges. Spa packages, excursions, even a premium bar pass, all booked under my card. When I called to ask, Margaret laughed it off. "Oh, come on, Liz, you've always been the generous one. We'll settle up after the trip." It wasn't the first time she'd borrowed from me. I told myself it wasn't worth starting a fight over, that this was supposed to be about healing. A few days later, during Sunday dinner at Mom's, my brother-in-law Thomas leaned back in his chair and said, "So Liz, have you updated your will lately? I mean, with all your assets, you should make sure it's, clear." Margaret smacked his arm. "Don't be morbid." But she was smiling, and so was he. "I'm fine, thanks," I said, forcing a smile. My stomach churned. That was the 3rd time in a week someone in the family had brought up my will. Then came the TikTok. My niece sent it to me, laughing, saying, "Aunt Liz, look, Aunt Claire is trying to be trendy." The video was shaky, shot in a kitchen I didn't recognize. My sister-in-law Claire stood in front of the camera, holding a fishing net, mouthing along to some pop song. The caption read, "The big catch is coming." I laughed along with my niece, but something in my chest tightened. Big catch? The net? The way Claire looked off camera before breaking into a grin, it felt pointed. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this trip was a chance to repair what was broken. I told myself I was imagining the strange way Margaret kept asking if I had all my important documents in order before leaving. But the truth? I'd been ignoring the signs for years. The little jokes about my savings, the way Margaret's tone would shift when she talked about my house, my investments. The subtle way they would make me feel like my success was a debt I owed them. Still, I packed my bags. Still, I told myself that maybe they'd changed, that maybe I'd get my sister back. The night before we left, I sat on my couch, suitcase by the door, scrolling through my phone. I opened the TikTok again. Claire's grin froze in place as the video looped, the net swinging toward the camera. I didn't know it then, but that was the first thread of the net they'd been weaving for months, and I was already tangled in it. I closed my eyes, exhaled, and thought, they're my family. What's the worst that could happen? That question would haunt me soon enough. The dining room shimmered under the golden light of chandeliers, the hum of conversation blending with the gentle clink of cutlery. I was halfway through a forkful of seared salmon when I felt a small tug on my sleeve. My niece, Emily, stood beside me, her face pale. "Auntie," she whispered, her voice so low I had to lean in to hear, "Stop the boat now." For a moment, I thought she was joking, but her eyes, wide, darting to the table where Margaret, Thomas, and Claire sat, told me otherwise. My heart kicked hard against my ribs, a sharp rush of adrenaline flooding my veins. "What's wrong?" I murmured, my voice steady, only because I willed it to be. She swallowed, glancing over her shoulder before speaking again. "They had a meeting last night, in the lounge, after everyone else went to bed. I heard them. They were talking about papers, some kind of power of attorney. They said you'd sign it before the ship reaches St. Kitts." The salmon on my plate might as well have been sand. My mind spun, every cell in my body screaming to react, to run, to confront. But I forced myself still. "If the ship gets there," she added, her lip trembling, "everything you have will be gone." I sat back slowly, letting my gaze drift to the table across the room. Margaret was laughing at something Thomas had said, her wineglass raised in a toast. Claire leaned in close, a conspiratorial smile tugging at her lips. It looked so normal, so safe. I smiled back, just enough to seem relaxed. "Thank you, Emily," I said softly. "Go sit down now, we'll talk later." Inside, my pulse thundered. Outside, I kept my composure. The storm could rage all it wanted inside me, but no one else could see it. For the rest of the evening, I played my part. I laughed at Margaret's stories, nodded when Thomas talked about his latest golf scores, even joined Claire for a dance. But while I moved through the steps, my eyes never stopped scanning. Every whispered exchange between them, every glance that passed over my head, every time one of them left the table for just a moment too long. At one point, Margaret reached for the bread basket and our eyes met. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw something there, not warmth, not even politeness, but calculation. A flicker gone almost before it began. The band shifted into a slower song, and I let myself drift toward the railing at the edge of the dining deck. The cool night air wrapped around me, carrying the scent of salt and faraway shores. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes and remembered a different time. I was 13, Margaret 15. We were walking home from school when a group of older kids cornered us. One grabbed my backpack, rifling through it for cash. Margaret stepped in front of me then, chin high, daring them to touch me. She didn't back down until they left. I remember thinking she would always protect me. I let out a long breath, the memory fading under the weight of the present. Somewhere along the line, that protector had become something else. When I returned to the table, something new caught my eye. A man I didn't recognize was standing behind Thomas, leaning down to speak quietly into his ear. The man was sharply dressed, his suit crisp even in the humid air, a briefcase in one hand. His face was unfamiliar, but the way he carried himself, the precision, the confidence, was unmistakable, legal. I watched as Thomas nodded and passed him a small folder. The man tucked it into his briefcase without looking around, then straightened and walked calmly toward the exit. I felt a chill ripple through me. Who was he? He wasn't family, that much was clear. And yet, he moved like someone with a stake in whatever was about to happen. Emily slipped back to my side, her small hand brushing mine under the table. "That's him," she whispered. "Who?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the man's retreating back. "The lawyer," she said. "They called him Mr. Haynes. He knows everything about your accounts. I heard them say you've already given him more access than you realize." The room seemed to tilt for a second, the clinking of silverware turning sharp in my ears. My skin prickled. Why would a stranger know anything about my finances? Why was he on this ship, meeting with them in plain sight? I forced another smile as Margaret caught my eye again, this time tilting her head toward the dessert table. I nodded, excusing myself to follow her. But in my mind, the question burned hotter than the Caribbean sun. Why would someone I had never met know so much about what was mine? The moment I closed my cabin door that night, I locked it and slid my suitcase onto the bed. From the hidden compartment in the lining, I pulled out a small black pouch. Inside was my insurance policy, a palm-sized camera with a motion sensor, something I'd bought months ago after watching one too many true crime documentaries. I had never imagined I'd need it for my own family. I slipped it into an open slot on the shelf above the cabin's minibar, angled toward the door. The next morning, while the others were at breakfast, I retrieved it and connected it to my laptop. The playback showed Margaret, Thomas, Claire, and Mr. Haynes inside my cabin while I'd been on deck. They spoke in low voices, flipping through documents I recognized, copies of my bank statements, property deeds, even my life insurance policy. Margaret's voice was steady. "Once she signs, we transfer immediately. No delays." Claire laughed. "She won't even realize it until it's done." My stomach turned. I kept watching, forcing myself to hear every word. That was when Thomas mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "I've been getting updates from our inside source. She's alone most evenings. Should be easy to get her to a quiet spot." Inside source? My mind scrambled through every interaction I'd had. Only a handful of people knew my schedules on this trip. That night, I borrowed Emily's phone under the pretense of showing her a game. A notification popped up, a muted group chat named Seize the Deal. I tapped it, my heart pounding. The messages were all there, times, locations, steps of the plan. And then the betrayal solidified in black and white. From an unnamed contact, "She trusts me. She'll sign if I tell her it's just a formality for the trip insurance." Margaret had replied with a smile emoji. I stared at the screen, my hands cold. If the number belonged to the person I suspected, I wasn't just about to lose my savings. I was about to lose the last piece of my trust. The next morning, I pulled Emily aside in the ship's library. where the hush of turning pages gave us privacy. "I need your help," I told her, "and I need you to tell me everything you've heard, exactly as you heard it." She hesitated, chewing her lip. "They think I don't know much, but I do, and I hate it." "You're not alone," I said. "We're going to fix this, but we can't do it alone." That afternoon, fate handed me my first ally. A broad-shouldered man in a staff uniform stopped me near the aft deck. "Ma'am," he said in a low voice, "I couldn't help overhearing some of your relatives the other night. You might want to be careful." He introduced himself as Mark, a former police detective turned ship security. I didn't hesitate. I told him everything. His jaw tightened with each detail. "You're lucky you've got time," he said. "Most people don't see it coming until it's too late." Later that day, Emily and I took our seats at a trivia event in the lounge. An older gentleman slid into the chair beside me, introducing himself as Richard. We got to talking, and when I mentioned the name Haynes, his expression sharpened. "I know that name," Richard said slowly. "He was involved in a case I worked on years ago, a contested estate worth millions. He didn't just represent the family, he orchestrated the transfer of assets to himself and a partner. It was infamous." The realization sank in like an anchor. Haynes wasn't just some opportunistic lawyer, he was a professional predator, and my family had brought him right to me. That night, I found Emily in the cabin, reading by the small desk lamp. I sat beside her. "Do you know why I've always looked out for you?" I asked. She glanced at me, uncertain. "Because you're my aunt?" "Because you remind me of me when I was your age," I said softly, "and I know what it feels like to see things you wish you didn't. But you're brave, Emily, braver than you know." Her eyes glistened, but she nodded. We spent the next hour planning with Mark and Richard, mapping out how to gather more evidence and when to act. Every piece had to be in place. Timing would be everything. As I lay in bed later, the ship rocking gently beneath me, I realized something chilling. Richard had said Haynes's last job was years ago, but from the way my family spoke, they'd known him long before this trip. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment scheme. It was a game that had started long before I ever set foot on this ship. The final night of the cruise arrived draped in gold and velvet. The grand ballroom glimmered under chandeliers, a string quartet playing soft waltzes while waiters weaved through the crowd with champagne. Every guest was dressed to impress. The air buzzed with celebration. I had chosen this night for a reason. There would be no quiet corner for secrets to hide. Not with the captain, senior officers, and hundreds of passengers in attendance. I had rehearsed my part carefully. A little flushed from a glass of wine, my steps just loose enough to seem tipsy, I let Margaret guide me toward a small table tucked near the stage. Thomas and Claire were already there, smiling as if this were a casual chat among family. In front of them sat a thin stack of papers, neatly clipped, and a pen with a gold cap. Margaret leaned in. "Just a quick formality, Liz, for the trip insurance and some financial housekeeping. Sign here and we'll all be set." I took the papers, letting my fingers trace the edge as though I wasn't quite steady. My eyes skimmed the first page, then the second. My throat tightened. This wasn't just a power of attorney, it was a transfer of all my liquid assets, plus a clause making me liable for shared family debts, totaling over $300,000. My signature wouldn't just empty my accounts, It would chain me to their financial ruin. I looked up, letting a slow, sheepish smile spread across my face. "All right," I said, my voice warm. "If it'll make things easier." Margaret's shoulders loosened. Thomas exhaled, relief flashing across his face. Claire reached for her champagne, her eyes darting to the dance floor as if the matter was already settled. Inside, my pulse was steady. I would sign something tonight, but not this. As the captain stepped on stage to make a toast, I gave Mark the faintest nod from across the room. He slipped away toward the control booth at the back. Seconds later, the massive projection screen behind the stage flickered. The slideshow of scenic cruise photos dissolved into a paused video, grainy from my hidden camera. Voices filled the room. "Once she signs, we transfer immediately. No delays." Margaret's voice, clear as day. Claire's laugh followed. "She won't even realize it until it's done." The ballroom went still, heads turned toward our table. Margaret's face drained of color. The video rolled on, showing snippets of their meetings in my cabin, the group chat screenshots, and Mr. Haynes receiving the folder. Gasps rose from the crowd, whispers spreading like wildfire. I set the papers down gently and pulled another stack from my purse, copies of every piece of evidence, neatly labeled. I handed them to the captain himself. "For you and ship security," I said, my voice carrying just enough to be heard by the nearest tables. Mark and Richard appeared at my side, their presence quiet but commanding. The captain's jaw was tight as he flipped through the pages, then signaled to the security officers. Margaret stammered, This is being taken out of context." But before she could finish, another voice cut in. It was Olivia, a friend I'd made early in the cruise. A woman who had shared dinners with me, laughed with me, listened to my worries. She stepped forward, her face pale. "Liz," she said, "I need you to know I was the one feeding them information." Her voice shook. "They told me it was just to help smooth things over with you, that it was harmless, but they lied to me too." The confession hit like a rogue wave. I felt the sting, but I also saw the truth in her eyes, betrayal layered on betrayal. They had played her as well, making her believe she was helping me while setting me up for ruin. The captain's voice cut through the tension. "We'll sort this out in the security office, now, in the..." His officers moved in, collecting the documents, separating Margaret, Thomas, and Claire from the rest of the guests. Around us, the music had stopped completely. Passengers stared, some whispering, others holding up their phones to record the scene. The once perfect evening had turned into a public reckoning. As the security team led them out, I caught Margaret's eyes one last time. There was no apology there, no shame, only a cold awareness that the game had turned against her. The celebration slowly resumed in the room, but for me, the night's work wasn't over. I still had questions, and the storm, though broken, hadn't yet passed. When a ship cuts through the water, I thought, not everyone makes it back to shore. By the time the ship reached port, the morning sun had turned the harbor into a sheet of gold. But the warmth in the air couldn't thaw the tension that gripped the deck. The captain's orders had been clear. Margaret, Thomas, and Claire were confined to their cabins until we docked. Security kept watch, ensuring there was no last-minute escape. As the gangway lowered, I saw them. Uniformed officers lined up along the pier, their presence sharp and official against the bright backdrop. Mark walked beside me as we disembarked, the weight of my evidence tucked under his arm. Richard followed close, his gaze scanning the crowd like a hawk. The moment the suspects stepped onto the dock, the officers moved in, the air filled with clipped commands, the metallic snap of handcuffs. Margaret's protest was loud enough to draw the attention of curious tourists nearby, her voice rising in indignation. "You can't do this. We're family," she shouted at me, as if that word was still a shield. Thomas tried a different tactic, claiming it was all a misunderstanding and that the documents were never meant to be filed. Claire just stared at the ground, her jaw set, refusing to meet my eyes. Within minutes, they were escorted toward waiting patrol vehicles. The officers thanked me for my cooperation, promising to contact me as the investigation progressed. But even as I watched them go, my focus drifted elsewhere, to the empty space beside them. Mr. Haynes was nowhere to be seen. I turned to Mark. "Where is he?" Mark's expression was grim. "Disappeared last night. Security footage shows him leaving the ship with a small bag during a supply transfer. By the time anyone realized, he was gone." The thought sank like a stone. A predator like Haynes wouldn't just vanish, he'd be laying low, planning his next move. One fish had slipped through the net. Back in my hotel room that night, I turned on the television. It didn't take long for the news to find me. My name wasn't mentioned, but the headline was unmistakable. "Heist on the high seas. Family fraud foiled on luxury cruise." The footage from the gala played in loops, Margaret's shocked face, the captain receiving the folder, the grainy video from my hidden camera. Within hours, the story spread online. Twitter was a whirlwind of outrage and fascination. Comment sections overflowed with disbelief. Who does that to their own sister? Imagine plotting this on a vacation. That aunt is a legend. The hashtag heist in the high seas began trending. Then the messages started coming in, emails, social media DMs, from strangers who had seen the story. Many were victims of similar schemes, some by friends, others by their own families. The most striking were the ones who claimed to know Margaret, Thomas, and Claire from before. "They tried to pull something on me years ago," one message read. "Different setup, same pattern. Glad you stopped them." The realization was sobering. I wasn't their first target, just the one who'd fought back hard enough to make it public. A few days later, I met someone I hadn't seen in years. Carla, a college friend I'd lost touch with. We ran into each other at a cafe near the courthouse, where I'd been filing follow-up paperwork. "I saw the news," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Margaret, she tried to rope me into a business deal once. I backed out when it didn't feel right. I'm sorry you had to go through this, Liz." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Carla had been there for me in small but meaningful ways back in school. Late-night talks, shared textbooks, the kind of loyalty that's rare. Seeing her now, hearing her say she believed me, felt like a quiet balm after weeks of sharp edges. We talked for over an hour, not just about the case, but about the years we'd missed. For the first time since the cruise began, I felt something other than adrenaline or exhaustion. I felt human again. But even as we laughed about old memories, the shadow of the unfinished business lingered. Haynes was still out there. And predators like him didn't retire, they regrouped. As I left the cafe, the late afternoon sun catching on the courthouse steps, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This battle might be over, but the war wasn't. Another storm was coming. The first thing I did when I returned home was purge my contact list. Every number tied to Margaret, Thomas, Claire, or anyone even loosely connected to them gone. My email filters were set to send anything from their addresses straight to the trash. Social media accounts were locked down. Privacy settings turned to the strictest levels. I even changed my phone number, a move I hadn't made in over a decade. Next came the practical defenses. I hired a cybersecurity firm to audit every account I owned. They combed through my bank, investment, and insurance portals, flagging suspicious activity and setting up multi-factor authentication on every login. My credit was frozen to prevent any unauthorized loans or purchases in my name. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was survival. Weeks passed in a quiet rhythm. The news cycle moved on, and the chaos of the cruise faded into the background. Emily and I spoke often. She was back at school, safe, and slowly letting go of the fear that had shadowed her on the ship. For the first time in a long while, my days felt like mine again. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a package arrived on my doorstep. No return address. The box was small, light, and rattled faintly when I shook it. Inside, beneath layers of tissue paper, was a single object, a brass key. It was old, ornate, the kind you'd expect to find in a bank from the last century. Attached to it was a scrap of paper with just 5 words written in neat block letters. "You don't know everything yet." My stomach nodded. I didn't need to guess what it opened. I could picture it already. The safe deposit box Margaret had once mentioned years ago in a conversation I'd half forgotten. I stood there in my kitchen, the key heavy in my palm. The cruise had ended. The arrests had been made. But now I had to wonder, had I truly escaped? Or had I only cut through the first layer of a much larger net? I tucked the key into a locked drawer. Not yet, I told myself, but I knew the question would follow me. In the meantime, I focused on building something new, something that couldn't be stolen. I shifted my investments into low-risk, diversified portfolios and bought a small coastal property I'd always dreamed of. From there, I started the Carter Fund, a scholarship program for survivors of financial abuse. The first round of applications came flooding in, each story as heartbreaking as it was familiar. Speaking at events and panels, I found my voice again. I stood in rooms full of strangers and told them exactly how a family can turn predator and how to protect themselves before it's too late. The applause never mattered as much as the quiet moments afterward. Someone pressing my hand and whispering, "That happened to me too." Support grew into a community. People who had been isolated by betrayal found each other through the network we built. It was messy, imperfect, and real, and it was stronger than anything my so-called family had ever offered. One afternoon, I took Emily to the harbor. The air was brisk, the kind that carried both salt and promise. We stood at the railing, watching a massive cruise ship ease away from the dock. Families waved from the decks, their laughter carrying faintly over the water. Emily leaned on the rail beside me. "Do you think you'll ever go on one again?" I smiled faintly. "Maybe, but if I do, it'll be on my terms, with the right people." We stood in silence for a while, just watching the ship grow smaller against the horizon. I felt the calm settle into my bones, tempered, measured, but real. The past would always be there, just like the sea, deep, unpredictable, and capable of swallowing you whole if you weren't careful. But I wasn't afraid of it anymore. The ocean was wide, the future was wider, and I knew exactly how to steer my own course. Bien caronglon, I thought. the words forming with quiet certainty. Nhung toi biết, kach cheo lai quoc joy min.